It was just another flight, or so it seemed. An elderly black woman, quietly seated, was looking forward to a peaceful journey. But things took a shocking turn when the flight attendant refused to serve her. The woman, calm yet visibly upset, tried to reason with the attendant, but her request was met with cold indifference. The tension in the cabin was palpable as other passengers started to notice the exchange. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more uncomfortable, her son stood up. His voice cut through the murmurs of disbelief, and what he said next stunned everyone. Who was this woman? And why was she treated like this? Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking truth behind this encounter, one that would change everything for the flight crew and the passengers who witnessed it. As the flight continued, whispers began to spread through the cabin. The elderly woman sat still, her eyes fixed on the seat ahead, while the flight attendant went about her duties, trying to avoid making eye contact. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, some unsure if they had seen what they thought they had seen. The tension grew, but no one dared to speak up until her son, sitting across the aisle, stood up. His voice, calm but firm, echoed through the cabin. "You don't know who she is, do you?" he asked, staring directly at the flight attendant. The question hung in the air, heavy with something unsaid. The woman's son then began to tell a story, one that would reveal a side of his mother few knew about. As the flight crew and passengers leaned in, eager to hear what came next, the truth began to surface, but not everyone was ready for it. The son's words hung in the air, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The flight attendant stiffened, unsure of how to respond. She glanced at the elderly woman, her expression unreadable, then back at the son, who was now speaking more urgently. "My mother was a trailblazer, someone who fought for equality when it wasn't popular. She stood up when it mattered." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the passengers. The tension deepened. The flight attendant's face turned pale, and her eyes darted around the cabin, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Some passengers looked confused. Then the son did something that took everyone by surprise. He stepped back and reached into his bag, pulling out a folded document. The air seemed to tighten even more as he unfolded it, revealing an old, yellowed photograph of his mother. The image was unmistakable. There she was, younger, standing proudly in a sea of people, holding a sign that read "Equal Rights for All." The crowd gasped as they looked at the iconic image, the same woman who had been treated with indifference moments earlier. But that wasn't all. The son turned the photo toward the flight attendant. "This is who you chose to ignore," he said, voice low but firm. The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point, and it felt like everything was teetering on the edge of something explosive. Would the flight attendant apologize? Would there be a confrontation? The room felt charged, as if everyone was waiting for the next move, uncertain of how this encounter would end. Just as the passengers began to murmur amongst themselves, the unexpected happened. A voice came from the back of the cabin, cutting through the growing tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" A tall man, dressed in a sharp suit, stood up. His presence was commanding, and his tone carried an air of authority. He was a stranger to most, but the way he moved toward the front suggested he wasn't just another passenger. The son's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" he asked, a hint of anger in his voice. The man's gaze briefly flickered to the elderly woman before he answered with a cold smile. "I'm with the airline," he said, his words dripping with something more than professionalism. "And I believe you're making a scene." For a moment, no one moved. The passengers were caught between disbelief and curiosity. But then the man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the son's face. "I know who you are," the man said, his tone shifting, becoming almost mocking. "And I know what this is about." The son clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as the room seemed to close in around them. The sudden appearance of this stranger only deepened the mystery, leaving everyone unsure of where the story was heading. "You think you know me?" The son shot back, his voice sharp. "Then you must know who my mother is, too." The stranger's smile faded as he glanced once more at the elderly woman, his expression betraying a flicker of recognition. "Oh, I know exactly who she is," he said, the words now laced with a hidden meaning. "But that doesn't change the fact that your presence here is problematic." The son's eyes flashed with confusion. "Problematic? Are you threatening us?" But before the man could respond, the elderly woman slowly stood up. Her movements were deliberate, and for the first time, she spoke, her voice quiet but powerful. "This isn't about me," she said, her gaze now fixed firmly on the stranger. "This is about you." The room fell into an eerie silence. The passengers were transfixed, unsure of what was unfolding. Who was this man really? And what did he know that was now hanging in the air? Thick with the weight of untold, the man in the suit seemed to shrink under her gaze. His confident demeanor cracked as he struggled to keep his composure. I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes shifting nervously between her and the sun. But just as the moment seemed to settle, the final twist hit. The son stepped forward, his gaze now cold and intense. "And here's the part you didn't count on," he said, pulling out a second piece of paper. A legal document this time, stamped with a bold seal. "This woman, my mother, was never supposed to be on this flight in the first place. Your company made a mistake. A big one." The room's tension surged once more as the flight attendant's eyes widened, realizing the truth. Clara Bell wasn't just a passenger who had been overlooked. She was a key figure in a case that had been settled just days before. The airline had promised her a seat, a special allowance for the history she represented, yet her treatment had been anything but respectful. Now her son was holding the company accountable. The stranger's mask of control slipped completely as he saw the legal ramifications unfolding before him. This is beyond my control," he muttered, the weight of the situation dawning on him. Clara Bell turned to the flight attendant, her expression softening just slightly. "I don't blame you," she said quietly. "But you must understand, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something much deeper." The flight attendant's eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't mean." But Clara raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "It's not about what you meant. It's about how we make people feel invisible when we don't take the time to understand their worth." The passengers, many of whom had been silent witnesses to the conflict, began to nod in quiet agreement, murmuring to each other. Some had seen the woman's courage firsthand, others were just beginning to realize it. The mystery had unraveled, but the depth of the journey was far from over. As the plane finally began its descent, the passengers felt something shift in the air. Clara Bell, the mother, the legend, had not only reclaimed her dignity, but had shown everyone in that cabin what it truly meant to stand tall in the face of erasure. The flight attendant, the stranger, and even the passengers had learned that history wasn't just something to read about. It was alive, sitting right beside them, every single day. And just before the plane touched down, Clara looked at her son, her eyes glistening with a quiet triumph. "It's never too late to fight for what's right," she whispered. And for the first time, everyone on that plane understood exactly what she meant. As the plane finally touched down, the tension that had filled the air seemed to dissipate. Clara Bell sat quietly, her son beside her, both now a symbol of resilience. The flight attendant, still processing everything that had happened, approached them as the plane emptied. She hesitated, but Clara gave her a gentle nod, signaling that she wasn't angry, just deeply hurt by the system that had overlooked her. The attendant, humbled and remorseful, quietly apologized. When the plane landed, Clara and her son exited the aircraft, their heads held high, the story of their legacy unfolding before the eyes of everyone who witnessed it. The stranger in the suit, now visibly shaken, disappeared into the crowd, knowing this encounter would cost him far more than he could have anticipated. The passengers who had once ignored Clara now saw her with a new understanding. This wasn't just an ordinary flight. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with one person's courage to stand up and demand respect.